Greetings, Namaste, Nibula, and Kia ora. I am John Lucas, President and CEO of ICEP Study Abroad. Welcome to our session, Balancing the Learning Abroad Environmental Impact, a Pledge for a Greener Tomorrow. We want to thank the U.S. Department of State and the U.S. Consulate in Auckland, as well as our friends and colleagues from Australia, New Zealand, Fiji, and the United States for your shared commitment to building a more environmentally sustainable international exchange community. Introducing our session tonight is Daniel Walsh. Daniel is a Foreign Service Officer at the U.S. Consulate in Auckland. Before joining the U.S. Department of State, Daniel worked as Operations Director of a digital marketing agency in Edinburgh, Scotland. His experience also includes work as a data analyst in the technology and higher education sectors and experience serving as a pastor. Originally from North Dakota, Daniel has spent most of his adult life in Boston, while also spending time in Washington, D.C. and Brazil. He has an undergraduate degree in international relations and master's degrees in history and theology. Please welcome Daniel.
Well, good morning and good evening, everyone. Thanks for having me today. It's good to see you all. And thanks for giving me this opportunity to kick off this session. As John said, my name is Daniel Walsh, and I am a U.S. diplomat serving currently at the consulate in Auckland, New Zealand. And I've had a soft spot for international education since even before I studied and worked internationally. As a child, my mother was responsible for placing more than 30 foreign exchange students in small farming towns in North Dakota. And as a university student, I spent a semester in France, and then as an adult, I worked as a designated school official helping international students study in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So as you can see, international education is important to me personally, and it's an important part of my own path to becoming a diplomat for the United States. So I'm honored to be a part of today's discussion. The climate change crisis presents to all of us an incredible array of challenges to overcome and problems to solve. For many decades, US universities have churned out reams of data alerting the world to this crisis and predicting the negative effects of rising temperatures on shorelines, biomes, and ice sheets. The United States government has worked with like-minded partners for many years to develop policies that work to mitigate these effects. These efforts culminated in the signing of the Paris Climate Agreement in December 2015. That agreement was signed by 196 countries, and efforts to get it ratified were led by then Secretary of State John Kerry. Within his first few hours in office, President Biden appointed Mr. Kerry as Special Presidential Envoy for Climate and signed an executive order recommitting the United States to the agreement. These actions indicate to Americans and to the world that the United States takes the climate change crisis seriously, and that leaders in the highest offices of government are working diligently to combat the negative effects of climate change in order to build a healthier, more sustainable planet for the future. The Biden administration has taken further steps to ensure climate change is central to its approach to governance. On Earth Day in April, President Biden hosted a leaders summit on climate in preparation for COP26, the nearly annual UN meeting on climate change, which is coming up this November in Glasgow. The summit brought together more than 40 heads of government, including the Prime Minister of New Zealand, for multiple sessions. It focused on thinking about mitigating the effects on climate change, while also stimulating economic incentives and creating sustainable, profitable enterprises as a result. In his remarks, President Biden said that the United States, quote, will have its greenhouse gas emissions within this decade, noting that countries that take decisive action now will reap the economic benefits of a clean energy future. The administration's efforts go deeper than public statements. One of President Biden's first executive orders was one that requires policy decisions made by foreign affairs agencies, including the Department of State where I work, to consider the impacts of every policy on climate change. Our day-to-day decisions are now guided by a simple question. What effect will this decision have on the climate? This administration takes the climate change crisis seriously, and we as professionals within the government take it seriously as well. From a Mission New Zealand perspective, we see climate change as an area of bilateral interest, and we continue to work to foster development and encourage serious, long-term conversations on these issues. We are happy to see that the international education community is also proactively addressing these challenges, as shown by the overwhelming interest and support we have had surrounding this conversation today. I would like to acknowledge that today we are honoring World Oceans Day by gathering as friends throughout the Pacific, including participants from Australia, Cook Islands, Fiji, New Zealand, Niue, Samoa, and the United States. Together, we can make a difference. I'm looking forward to today's discussions on how the climate change crisis impacts the international education sector, and I look forward to learning from you all. Thanks again for having me.
Thank you, Daniel. And now I would like to introduce our speakers for today. Our first speaker is Ailsa Lamont. After 25 years of professional experience spanning capacity building, social innovation, and international education, as well as roles as International Director and Pro-Vice Chancellor International at 3 Australian universities, Ailsa Lamont founded Pomegranate Global in 2016 to guide the education sector to take action on climate change. Ailsa has since trained with the Climate Reality Project, former US Vice President Al Gore's foundation, to catalyze a global solution to the climate crisis. In 2019, Lamont co-founded Climate Action Network for International Educators, CANI, a grassroots initiative by international education practitioners who see the need and the opportunity to step up and take greater action on climate. And our second speaker is Dr. Gil Latz. Dr. Gil Latz is Vice Provost for Global Strategies and International Affairs and Professor of Geography at The Ohio State University. His appointment includes serving as President of Ohio State University Global Gateway Network, overseeing offices in Shanghai, Mumbai, and Sao Paulo. Gil Latz is broadly interested in the internationalization of higher education in the United States and in Asia. His research career has focused on comparative study of regional development and resource management policy in East Asia, North America, and Europe. He currently researches the role played by philanthropy and civic leadership in Japan's modernization process. Latz holds a BA from Occidental College, majoring in religious studies and English literature. He earned graduate degrees, MA and PhD in geography from the University of Chicago. Gil Latz was a graduate research student at the University of Tokyo as part of his dissertation fieldwork on 20th century agricultural development policy. And in 2001, he was a Fulbright research affiliated scholar at the University of Florence, studying the conservation of cultural landscapes. Gil Latz's national leadership includes service as president of the Association of International Education Administrators and senior associate for internationalization at American Council on Education, and the advisory board, an advisory board member for the US-Japan Higher Education Engagement Society. So the format for our session today will be a conversation. As the title suggests, it's about balance, and there are really two main concepts that we want to explore today. What impact international education can make on slowing, investigating, or reversing climate change in the Pacific region specifically and around the world generally. And number two, how to mitigate the climate change impact of international education in the region. Both our speakers can speak to both of these topics, and both will share their perspective and expertise with us. We will be scanning the chat for more questions, so feel free to type your questions into the chat box, but we have a few questions prepared to get us started. We'll devote the final 15 minutes of the first hour to live question and answers with the audience. Then at the hour mark, we will transition into breakout rooms, one or more, depending on the number of participants. And we will say goodbye to Gil and myself, but Ailsa will stay to work with you specifically, and our staff from ICEP will be in the chat rooms to help keep the conversation flowing. So our first topic is on the impact on the is about the impact on the region of climate change. And so I'd like to ask both Ailsa and Gil, what is the current and forecasted impact of climate change in the Pacific region?
Thank you very much, John, for that warm introduction. And I appreciate the opening remarks of the Consul General from the Consulate in Auckland regarding today's event. And my counterpart, Ailsa Lamont, and I flipped a coin, and I get to go first. And she's going to comment in this first section on a few of the remarks I'm going to make. I think I'm ready for the slide to come up. Okay, so let me just start off before we go through a few quick slides regarding international education and climate change to level set our understanding. It's not only World Ocean Day. 2021 is the United Nations declaration that we are in a critical year to reset our relationship with nature, and experts warn that we're in a state of planetary emergency. And it was just in the press here in the United States today that we recorded the highest atmospheric CO2 ever last month in May of 2021. And I've pulled up this satellite composite of the Pacific Basin because my remarks are going to talk about sea level rise in this area as an example of impact, so that we are aware of the degree of the problem through sea level rising, but also setting the stage for our remarks over the course of the hour to suggest the role of education in addressing important questions that were gathered together today to consider. Let me just start out by saying that whenever I see this composite of the Pacific Basin, I think of Herman Melville and Moby Dick, and there's a wonderful quote there about the Pacific. This mysterious, divine Pacific zones the world's whole bulk about, makes all coasts one bay to it, seems the tide beating of the earth. In a less prosaic formulation, the Pacific is the largest body of water on the planet and represents 30% of the Earth's surface. A couple of definitional points before I go on to my next slide. Sea level rise is an example of global warming. It's of particular interest to continental and island states participating today. The United States Geological Service defines global warming as the rise in global temperatures due mainly to increasing concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And what's causing sea level to rise? Global warming is causing global mean sea level to rise in two ways. First, glaciers and ice sheets worldwide are melting, adding water to the ocean. Second, the volume of the ocean is expanding as the waters warm. And why is this especially important in the Pacific, particularly the Asian or the western side of the Pacific from the American perspective? It's because such global warming and the rise of sea level will have an outsized effect on the coastal lowlands in Asia Pacific. And such population concentration is a distinguishing characteristic of this part of the world. And thank you, Michael, for pulling up the second slide. This is referenced in my bibliography for all of you if you'd like to explore this a little bit further, but it's a map that captures how Asian cities are at risk due to sea level rise. 13 of the world's 20 megacities are situated along coastlines. The majority of these are in Asia. And, slide 3, please. This is an interactive map that's from another bibliographical reference that I have, which captures how recent mapping of coastal zones has tripled the number of people threatened by rising seas. Michael's moving the cursor back and forth, and this digital elevation model that's been recently incorporated from satellite imagery, which shows the darker red, indicates that there are many more people who are occupying areas along coastal zones than we had previously estimated. We now think that the amount of people affected by 2050 could equal 300 million people, mostly in Asia. And that's a huge increase from our previous projections of 79 million people. This data is from 2019. If you could move on to the next slide. Of course, I'm going to skip forward, Michael. One more. Now, one more. Thank you. So, of course, the most famous example in the recent past of the way in which lowland settlement is affected by earthquake, tsunami, or other associated events was in the Japanese devastating 2011 tsunami. And since then, Japan has spent $12 billion on seawalls, such as the one I've illustrated here in Ishinomaki. These are responses, they're reactive responses. They can play a role in protecting human life. But as we saw in 2011, the technology is not the fix. The fix will be the kinds of approaches that Elsa will comment on in just a minute that we need to think about more carefully in higher education. And then my last slide is of a projection of coastal flooding in Tokyo itself. This is a very large, one of the mega cities in the United States, of the world that I referred to a moment ago. We think that coastal flooding in 2100, based upon this new digital elevation model, will affect 37% of the population in the areas that you see here, as noted on the map, and that's about 3 million people. And I don't think seawalls will effectively respond to sea level rising inexorably over time. So with that, just to summarize, we need to reset our relationship with nature as the UN has asked. We're in a state of planetary emergency. We have the highest atmospheric CO2 recorded in May last month. And Elsa and her colleagues are doing some of the really important work in response to these challenges, and she's going to share some thoughts now. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you very much for that, Gil, and for the warm welcome, John and Daniel, and it's great to see so many of you here. And it's particularly, I think, life-affirming that so many people are turning out for these kinds of talks, especially in the midst of a global pandemic, which is obviously quite a lot to deal with on its own. And then, of course, people demand your attention for this kind of issue as well. And yet, with the global pandemic drawing so much of our attention, climate change has not gone away. It's not going anywhere just yet, not until we really do something drastic about it. And as Gil has very expertly shown there, that region, our region here in the Pacific, is incredibly relevant to international education. This is where most of the globally mobile students in the world come from, this region, those countries there which were shown with the very vulnerable coastlines, India, China, Vietnam. So many of the students that all of us will be working with in international education are directly affected by those changes, which are already happening. And I suppose that's one of the points I really want to stress. So some of the data that Gil shared there shows the impacts, the projected impacts in 2050 or by the end of the century. But obviously, climate change is actually upon us now. And for many of you, for example, I see my colleague from CANI, Adrian Fusick in San Diego's here. Good morning. California has been massively impacted by bushfires, by forest fires. Here in Australia, I'm in Melbourne. We've kind of almost forgotten about the horrific bushfires that we suffered here in the summer over late 2019, early 2020, because we lurched straight from that to the pandemic. But that was a horrific, very, very pivotal moment, I think, for Australia. When you look at how much, 20% of our forest burnt. And there's quite an astonishing statistic, which is that 57% of all adults in Australia were physically affected by the bushfire smoke. And that's quite some statistic. So I think when you have it, it will be very interesting to see how that plays out in politics down the line, when you have almost 2/3 of the population that has actually directly felt that impact of climate-related disaster. And if moving, well, first of all, moving to the north of Australia, I just want to share a personal anecdote that was retold at a climate event I was at a couple of years ago by a young man called Torres from the Torres Strait Islands, which is so the Torres Strait Islanders are one of the First Nations people of Australia. It's just between the northern tip of Australia and Papua New Guinea, a group of low-lying islands. And the sea levels have risen so much there already that some of the salination is becoming an incredible problem, and they're no longer able to grow the food that they need. And this is actually part of Australia. But one of the things that really horrified me was that the graves of their ancestors were actually starting to rise because of the seawater leaking in under some of their islands. So I don't wish to be, I'm not going to focus on the disaster side of things, because everyone knows this is serious. And we do want to talk a lot today about the solutions and the practical things that we can do within the international education community. But it is important to, I think, highlight just how real this is, and especially in this region, many of the low-lying Pacific Islands, some of the atolls, Fiji, so many countries are actually directly affected already. Many of you will know that the president of Tuvalu arranged a few years back to actually buy some land in Fiji in preparation for his country's people to actually have to move there as climate refugees. So the impact on our region is already here, and it's only about to become much more extreme. It impacts not, I suppose we have to think about in international student terms, it's impacting prospective international students. And then it also impacts the perspective of potential globally mobile students about the study destination. So for example, when Australia was in the grip of the bushfires, there was a 70% uptick in agent inquiries to institutions asking whether it was still safe. So I think anyone who thinks that international education will somehow be spared or immune to the effects of this is probably going to be disappointed. So those are my comments to follow up on what Gil opened with.
Thank you both for those insightful, if somewhat sobering remarks. I do think, as Ailsa, as you were just mentioning, it would be good now to think a little bit about some of the examples of international education programming that's really helping to address this, sort of how we can take action. And perhaps, Ailsa, you could start on this one.
Sure, thank you, John. Yes, I mean, the more positive news is that so many institutions, so many peak bodies and organizations are really switching on to the need to act and are looking very actively at what they can do. And there are already some great examples around the world of action that's being taken. So in terms of specific programs, there are a number of short-term study abroad programs, which obviously focus on sustainability issues, climate change, renewable energy, and so on. That brings us kind of immediately into the territory of, well, how do you balance the environmental cost of a short-term program with the benefits from actually studying the short-term program? So I'd like to talk just a little bit about that. And one is this idea of not just carbon footprint, but carbon handprint. So we all know about the carbon footprint, the emission, that's the negative side of the ledger, the emissions that are produced by pretty much everything we do, but certainly international travel, and by definition, almost international education comes with a relatively high carbon footprint as a result. The carbon handprint is the other side of the ledger, where you're looking at what positive impact you can have through your activities through international education. And so some of the kind of thoughtful learning abroad and study abroad operators and international offices around the world are looking at how they can build climate action in at every stage of that kind of learning abroad journey. So, for example, I know that in this region, the University of Auckland has been developing a program for its US study abroad cohort called Generation Climate Action. And the idea was that before those US students would come to New Zealand, they had to learn about the basics of climate action. So be climate action literate, eco-literate, understand what emissions would be associated with that travel and that study abroad program. Use the study abroad experience as a platform to actually engage in that climate conversation and to contrast what's happening in the US with New Zealand, and then to proactively come up with ways to assess what impact they could have both during their study abroad program and longer term over the length of their whole lives and careers. So that's one way which I think is I personally really welcome that kind of thoughtful embrace, because we're all in international education because we recognize the value of it. We recognize its potential transformative power. I have come across some instances where some some institutions have decided to simply cut all short-term study abroad as a way of reducing their emissions. And I have to say, I'm not comfortable with that approach, partly because we know that short-term study abroad really does open doors to a much broader range of students who might not otherwise get the chance to have that kind of internationalized education experience. So I think we need to be careful how we balance it. We'll probably come on to this in a little bit more detail later, because I know some of you did put in questions beforehand about offsetting. And my view on offsetting is that it's a bit like washing your hands to deal with COVID-19. Of course, you should do it. It's just not nearly enough on its own. And but if you use it as part of a broader strategy that looks at specifically trying to cut the emissions where possible, choosing lower carbon modes of travel, flying directly rather than having multiple flights, because a large chunk of the emissions associated with aviation actually occur at takeoff and landing. So the fewer flights you can take to get to a destination, the better. Actually intentionally thinking about how to design and structure your programs so that it's as low carbon as possible, that your students gain the most insights and knowledge as possible about where this study abroad activity is placed in terms of generating emissions and what they can do, and using every opportunity to actually try to influence partners. I think that if you take that kind of holistic approach, then there is probably still a way where you can retain the benefits and the incredible value of study abroad, but still take a more sustainable approach to it. And I think
Thank you. There's a lot in there. And I understand, Gil, that there are some great examples at Ohio State as well.
Yes, I wanted to briefly comment on 3 examples. The first one I would call an innovation in our Education Abroad office. We took the step this year, and this is not unique to Ohio State University, but an illustration of a trend. We took the step this year to rename our office from Education Abroad to Global Education. And we did this because we wanted to open up the opportunity to look at intercultural competency acquisition to more students. We saw opportunities to study other cultures in our own US society, while at the same time continuing to support this unique experience, as Elsa says, of the either long-term or especially more popular these days at our institution, the shorter-term education abroad program. So this is one innovation that I think will obviously have some impact on carbon footprint or handprint. The second example is that after 30 years and many preliminary years of reflection, the university has decided to revise its general education requirements. These, for those of you outside the United States, these are the requirements that all students take, regardless of major. And it's really impressive to see that the faculty have created a foundational course called Citizenship for a Diverse and Just World. And this then leads to related courses that are required of all students, where they choose between sustainability, lived environments, and health and well-being. And I think that touching as many of our students as possible through the curriculum, stimulating their interest in looking at the world that's far away and unfamiliar, whether it's close at hand or in another part of the world, is another important step that we're taking. And then finally, of course, last but not least, we have a wide variety of education abroad programs at the university, 100 plus, going to 40 plus countries. We were ranked in the top 10 nationally among doctoral institutions for the number of students studying abroad, third in the Big Ten. That's about 3,000 students a year, according to the latest Open Doors report of November 2020. And as I just alluded to it, 50% of these programs are faculty led. I'm not going to go through all these courses. I've put into the bibliographical reference the link to our webpage, but the key colleges include food, agricultural, environmental sciences, which include programs in New Zealand and Australia, just to pick that part of the world, that part of the Pacific. Another key college is our College of Engineering, and then of course our Arts and Sciences College and our College of Business. And one final point here is that we just learned last month that we were among the 26 US colleges and universities awarded a 2021 IDEAS grant. The IDEAS stands for Increase and Diversify Education Abroad for US students. And I want to commend the State Department for creating this opportunity for our university and others. But it's not so much the award itself, it's the idea behind it that I thought it would be useful as we talk about constructive steps together, Elsa and I. Could we have a sustainability theme similar to the diversity, increase, diverse, and diversify education abroad for US students? Could we highlight the sustainability theme as part of the Fulbright program, which is supportive of students going out, students coming in, and faculty scholars going both ways? I mean, those are the kinds of ideas, I think, that really touch on the youth who are making such a significant difference in raising awareness. And I think in partnership with academic organizations and nonprofit organizations, we can work together toward accomplishing mutually defined goals.
Some really good ideas in there from both of you. And there's so many good questions that folks have given us that it's hard to pick one topic. But since you have been talking about some really good programs that you each have ideas on, one of the questions from our audience was, how do you implement and then assess the impact of some of these programs that you've been talking about and at your institutions? If either one of you want to take that.
Well, Gil, do you want to go first on your specific programs, and then I might broaden it out a bit to some of the.
Okay, because I know that you've done a lot of thinking about this. I think we all run the risk of sounding a bit like statisticians. Not that there's anything wrong with being a statistician, but when we quantify and develop metrics for learning, for global learning, it can sound as though it's an overly quantified approach to the learning experience, in this case, the experiential learning experience. But when you're in a public organization like mine, where you're funded by state and federal monies, it's very important to be accountable. And our pre-departure orientation is very carefully thought out for those students who have the opportunity to travel and study abroad. We also have reflective themes that run through our short-term programs that are faculty-led. This is also commonly practiced across the United States and elsewhere. And then most importantly, we see the students upon returning as being emissaries. As they have a responsibility to share with others who have not had the experience, the eye-opening insights they've developed, and to encourage others to imagine doing something that in many cases is not easily undertaken or easily contemplated. So those are measurements that can be placed into the curriculum, which we can share with you after the webinar today, that I think are illustrative of asking the question. It's not only an experience, but it's a learning experience that's tied to the literature related to whatever part of the world is or topic is being studied, and that there's a way in which the student reflects on that literature and his or her experience, and through that reflection develops a statement, a written exercise or a presentation, a PowerPoint, a poster that demonstrates to others that their learning has indeed gone below the surface and has had a meaningful impact on their individual experience in life. I'll stop at that point, Elsa, and see if you want to talk specifically about some of the ways in which you've been incorporating this idea into the work you're doing.
Yeah, thanks, Gil. So I want to make 3 different points. The first is just a statement, which is that I absolutely 100% believe that eco-literacy, climate action literacy, whatever you want to call it, should be required graduate attributes. I find it quite astonishing that people can actually graduate from a higher education institution without understanding the basics of what is happening to the world, to the climate, and what they might be able to do about it. So that's one. The second is to give you an example of another institution. This is the University of Strasbourg Business School in France, which recently brought in a kind of eco-literacy program for all of its students who study abroad. And I think they have about 500 a year who study abroad on a compulsory basis. And they've brought in a student conference on climate action for all of those students. They have an emissions dashboard. So when students are actually selecting which overseas partner they'll study with, it shows them the emissions associated with travel to that destination and gives them some options for how they can compensate for those emissions. And they have started looking at how to measure people's attitudes and awareness to climate pre and post their study abroad experience. But then on a kind of broader level, which brings me back to CANI, the Climate Action Network for International Educators. As I mentioned, it's a non-profit. I think we have some information in the handout for you all, so please do check that out. And you're welcome to join. It's a volunteer global organization, so the more the merrier. We're currently revising the website there. The new one should be out in the next few weeks. And as part of that, we're gathering case studies on how international educators around the world are actually tackling this. So you should start to see a nice little resource library developed there. But to go back to the point of which Gil made, which I absolutely love, about how we have a tendency to try to measure everything, and not everything that you can quantify is actually quantifiable, or at least there's not always that much merit in doing so. We've been talking at CANI about the overall, overall ambition within the international education sector we should be pushing for. We're planning to run a kind of canny COP26 to mirror the UN climate talks in November, where we're going to push the key players in international education around the world to lift their collective level of ambition and actually set some serious target goals. But of course, one of the problems with that is if you say, okay, you need to have your emissions, we don't have any baseline to measure it from, to measure it against. So it's always, and I imagine that's the same for many of your programs, but one of the things I would say is if you do start at least looking at your emissions, starting to track them, starting to make intentional choices about where you can bring them down, where you might be able to eliminate some. And ideally, I would say that should be at the back end where possible, so that perhaps you might cut down on staff and faculty associated travel while leaving the field more open for the students.
Thank you all. And I'd love to hear some more questions in the chat. I know we have a number of participants from Fiji, from Samoa. If any of you from the region or from New Zealand would like to ask a question. I know there were a number of folks in the pre-registration that were interested in specific regional concerns that might be different from one part of the Pacific Basin to the next. So I don't know if either of you could give an example of a very specific regional concern, Fiji, New Zealand, Southeast United States, that you might like to share. And of course, if any of you have questions from the region, please chat them in. Any specific examples of areas of concern that are unique to any of the regions there?
I'm going to let you go first this time, Elsa.
Okay.
You're embedded in the region much more than I am.
Well, I mean, I think one challenge that we have in this region, which is very much in contrast to Europe, is that when we talk about any form of international education, certainly up until COVID, it always involved physical travel. And in this region, that always means flying. So whereas, for example, if you look at Europe, the Erasmus program, which is the continental-wide, EU-wide program to support student mobility, they are putting in a great deal of effort to incentivize students to travel by train rather than by plane. That's something that we just can't do. You know, there might be the occasional study combination where that might work. For example, if you're going from Thailand to Singapore, but as a general rule, we're looking at flying. So we have to, probably more than most parts of the world, really tussle with that whole dilemma of when is it worthwhile flying versus the expected benefits of that study abroad experience.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
I'll throw out a different example, but I'll make it brief so we can really engage more in the specific questions that come up, John. You know, when I'm in these kinds of conversations, I was in one earlier today as well, the importance of implementation is emphasized over and over and over again. And so we can set lofty goals to have carbon emissions, but the real hard work is in the implementation, and the implementation requires partnership. And I think it's true of the land-grant universities, such as the one I represent here, but many universities around the world are now thinking more about what are the partnerships outside of the research initiative of the university in the community, where common goals that are defined as metrics can be identified, and then working collaboratively toward realizing whatever the goal might be. And it sometimes is referred to as intersectionality or intersector activity. And I think bringing together the academy, nonprofit organizations, government, business in manageable ways to address some of these urgent problems is important for us to think about. The research endeavor, the knowledge creation is what we do best at a university, but it's not the solution, the only solution or the whole solution to the problems that we're talking about today. And I think this partnership idea, if we can be thinking about that more creatively in venues like this, but beyond it, is important for us to be thinking and addressing.
John, could I just pick up on that, please? Because I'd like to make a point which I've kind of adapted from Dr. Jonathan Foley from Project Drawdown's excellent article on effective climate action. And that is that if you picture how to tackle climate change a bit like a chessboard, and you think about what we've actually been doing so far, you know, a lot of higher education institutions are doing fantastic work on the actual science, on the research about what is happening with climate change, what needs to be done, technological innovation, and also on teaching climate science. Institutions are generally doing an awful lot of work in most countries, certainly in the wealthier countries, about making their campus infrastructure more sustainable and investing in renewable energy and so on. But that's a bit like playing chess and deciding that you're only going to use the bishop and the knight, the bishop and the queen. We should be using every pawn on the chessboard. And that means thinking about every single aspect of what we do. And I think we sometimes, as international educators, underestimate our power to actually affect change. We have a great deal of control over how we actually run the business, the operations of international education. And that does have a direct impact through generation of greenhouse gas emissions. So Robin Shields at the University of Bristol did some research recently which calculated or estimated the greenhouse gas emissions associated with global student mobility at between 14 and 39 megatons per year. And to put that into perspective, that's the equivalent of taking about 3 million cars on the road every year, or the emissions of a small country like Croatia, or medium-sized country like Croatia. So, you know, we are actually contributing to the growth in emissions in the atmosphere. There are things we can do to lower that. That should be our first starting point. The next kind of layer of that is looking at what else and that involves looking at what else we can do in different ways to perhaps achieve the same outcome. So that means a greater role for collaborative online international learning, for example, even when we can go back to physical mobility. Then there's obviously the education piece. We're in education, so educating not just our students, but also our partners, also collaborating within the institution. So reaching out to the sustainability office or the facilities management office to say, where can we perhaps push jointly together? As a general rule, the international offices have a bit more clout and sway over what institutional policy is perhaps than those usually understaffed sustainability offices might. And then the final point is around advocating for policy change, using your purchasing choices wisely to influence and change behavior as well. So my plea would be that we should all try and think about using all the pieces on the chessboard.
I like both of those ideas, collaboration and really using all the pieces at your disposal. One of the other participants asked, speaking of those, what resources might be at your disposal? Are there funding sources? And I know Neil mentioned the US State Department grant that his institution was able to win, the IDEAS grant. Are there other examples of funding sources that might help some of the folks programming to be able to implement those programs?
Well, that's an excellent question, and the audience is so diverse, it's hard to give a comprehensive answer. I'll just speak in big generalities. I think one of the things that we've overlooked in the Academy is the role of our advancement office to collaborate with offices of international affairs or sustainability institutes to target funding opportunities. I think asking that question, are there ways in which the university I'm at or the organization that I'm part of can identify where to focus my attention in seeking outside funding? It could be from a federal agency in the United States, it could be from a private foundation, it could be from a business foundation. And it is an exercise that one can do on one's own, but if you can again enter into some kind of understanding with someone who knows a lot more about it, that is the best way to proceed. So I've spent many years now trying to convince the advancement office at various institutions to provide part of an employee's time to work with me on this question of targeting funding organizations. And I've had some success recently at creating a position that is in support of international questions as they relate to sustainability. I don't think it's unique to my efforts. I think it's asking that question and finding like-minded people on your campus or in your organization, and then seeing if you can make it into a priority among many competing other ideas. But it is important to do this, and it's not always possible to find the funds you want within your own organization. It calls for entrepreneurial thinking.
Yeah, and I think that's right. There are little pockets of funding available. So certainly within Europe, I mentioned Green Erasmus. That's not a little pocket, that's quite substantial, and that's affecting change on a continental basis. But it's harder elsewhere to find those funds yet. But I think absolutely, as Gil said, suggesting to the Fulbright, suggesting to other scholarship bodies that they specifically fund climate related or sustainability related programming or scholarships would be an incredibly powerful way to go. There are examples where some institutions, again, the ones I know of are mainly in Europe, University of Gothenburg, for example, or ETH Zurich, who have introduced kind of climate levies. So the University of Gothenburg charges a small fee, I think it's around $20 on every flight, every official student or staff related flight. That goes into a pot that staff and students can bid for to run sustainability projects. ETH Zurich in Switzerland has gone a step further. I believe they're actually introducing an emissions trading scheme between departments because they're also looking at cutting academic travel. And so they've got a really excellent and well-developed system of measuring the emissions involved in all of their kind of scope 3 activities. And they have great resources available online as well, which you can check out.
And since you're on that topic, Kara asks us, Elsa, if there are any resources you can recommend or perhaps Gil that evaluate the quality of the various carbon offset projects. And I know you've mentioned a lot of them there, but how do you actually go about evaluating?
That's a hard one. I had this question myself, not related to the university, but just a personal question. And I went to some financial organizations to see what they thought about it. And they really hadn't done the research at that time. So the last time I made an effort to collect such information, I wasn't successful. I don't have a website to recommend. I think this might be a question that we could carry away, the two of us, and offer to share with anyone whoever is asking the question. I'd like to think that there is an enterprising initiative out there that collects this information, but I'm not aware of it. Also may have a different answer, but that's mine for now.
Yeah, it's a really interesting area. Obviously, there's a lot of contentiousness around offsetting, partly because some people do kind of use it as a way to, almost like an atonement, and they buy their offsets and they say they've done that and they don't do anything else, and that's not obviously an ideal way forward. Also because there are inherent issues with offsets themselves. Good offsets have to be additional. You know that the activity wouldn't have happened if it weren't for you buying that offset. They have to be transparent, they have to be measurable. So definitely, if you are looking at offsets, they go for the ones that are gold standard. Generally, there's an awful wide variation in price too. As a very rough rule, they should be around kind of 20, 25 US dollars a ton. You can get good ones that are less than that, but if they're too cheap, then it's probably something to be a bit wary of. But one thing that has been really interesting is, and we've been working on through a specific project group with CANI, is that there doesn't appear to be really great program level advice for how you might measure emissions and then actually work to have a good quality offset. So we've got a group of academics and practitioners from around the world that are currently working on this. And it's Robin Shields, who I mentioned, is part of that group who did the original research on the emissions associated with student mobility, and it's being led by Professor Stephen Robinson in Ireland, who works for Champlain College. And it's been quite fascinating to find out just how little clear guidance there is. There are so many different free calculators and sets of guidance out there, but there's not one kind of specific set that clearly lays out what providers in international education might do. So we're hoping to kind of bring all that together and give some guidance, and also offer something so that hopefully we might have a basis that people could use to benchmark. That's all being done free of charge through CANI. If anyone does know of anything out there that you think we should be aware of, please do get in touch and let us know, or if you'd like to be part of that group.
Thank you. We're now getting to the end of our Q&A here with Ailsa and with Gil. We'll be saying farewell to Gil, but before he leaves, I want to give him a chance to say a couple of remarks. And I do encourage you all to stay. Past participants at these forums that we've done have said that the breakout rooms are really beneficial as they meet partners from other institutions, begin to establish relationships that can help lead to those kind of partnerships that we've been talking about. But before we do say goodbye to Gil and move into the breakout rooms, do you have any final thoughts for us?
I do. I just wanted to go back to Daniel Walsh's introductory comments and the reference to World Ocean Day. It reminded me that in 2014, the UN Environmental Program had its focus on World Environment Day campaign around Raise Your Voice, Not the Sea Level. And it drew attention to the issue of that I talked about, of rising oceans worldwide. And for those in the audience who work with students, the power of youth is not to be underestimated in addressing the climate crisis. And so helping our students through education, what is the problem? What are the potential solutions with an S to the problem? How do we arrive at consensus about problem solving that leads to the implementation of a policy? That is vitally important work, and the youth are very interested in this. They inspire us, those of us who are no longer young, and I think that is something to keep in mind, that it's about raising voices and encouraging people to speak up and participate in the process of solving this existential challenge that we face. And thank you very much for inviting me, ISEP and Department of State, and working with my colleagues here. And I look forward to continuing the conversation, even though I have to sign off right now.
Thank you so much for joining us, Gil. It's been a pleasure to reconnect with you, and thank you for your insightful and helpful comments. And now we will say goodbye to Gil and myself. Ailsa is going to stay with you again. Please do stay. We're going to have some small breakout groups, and this is your chance to meet colleagues from other institutions working on programs, international education programs, very much like yourselves. And don't forget to register for our next session, which is on partnerships in August. That was a topic you all asked for. We'll be hearing from one university in New Zealand and at least one from the US and possibly a couple of other universities. So please do sign up for the next one and stay. We're going to be transitioning to the small groups. Now Michael and Rory from ISEP will be putting you into your small groups.